Meredith, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm doing good, Ben. It's a beautiful day to talk about space and science.
Yeah, two of my favourite subjects, and I think yours as well. I actually thought of you today because I saw a trailer for the new Twister remake. I don't know if you've seen
Yes.
that iconic tornado chasing movie. Sounds like you have. I imagine that's part of what you do. Is that a good comparison or not really?
It's only one. It's like those pictures. I'm sure you've seen them, Ben, online where they have six different boxes. It's like what I do, what people think I do, what my mom thinks I do, what my friends think I do, and what I actually do. And always within somewhere there, people think of weather and they think of storm chasing. And I've done storm chasing before, but it's only really a small part of all the really cool things I've been able to do in my career. I have storm chased in Colorado. I worked out there for a little bit, and I can tell you the thrill, the stress, like it may look glamorous and dramatic in the movies, and there are some dramatic parts, but as a scientist, it's really fun to actually sit down and look at your forecast and calculate how fast a storm is moving and how fast your car is going to get to the right spot to film it coming in. And the one time my coworker and I were about a mile from a tornado, and it was just too dangerous to get any closer. So we actually parked just outside. But as it was passing, we couldn't see it because it was rain wrapped, but we could see the wind. We could feel the power of its storm. And thankfully, nothing bad happened because it's nature. You have to be careful. But it was such a really cool experience. And well, not for his truck, but afterwards there was a hailstorm. We followed another cell and we got to see ping pong ball size hail just start opening up from the sky.
Oh gosh, that sounds terrifying, to be frank. Um, well, we've dived straight in there. So you're a seasoned meteorologist and space correspondent. So obviously, this is the Astroben podcast, so we're more space orientated. But I haven't had a guest on yet that's a meteorologist. So I think that's quite an interesting perspective. What came first, your passion for meteorology or space, or were they sort of intertwined?
That's a great question. And this is, I guess, kind of a new thing for me because I've been wanting to be a meteorologist since I was 3. My mom actually survived a tornado outbreak. And for those that might be listening that are familiar with the super outbreak, it was in the Midwest. She was in Xenia, Ohio, and back in April 3rd and 4th of 1974. A tornado came through, very famous tornado. It was an F5 at the time, which is comparable to an EF5 when we talk about it in the enhanced Vegeta scale. And it literally wiped out all the homes in the neighborhood she was at except the one she was staying in. And she jokes, well, now she can joke, but at the time she said she was praying in the basement as the tornado was passing over the house. I just want to live to have a child someday. And guess who was the firstborn? And since then I wanted to kind of like Twister. I realized I wanted to help people and save people's lives and learn everything I could about tornadoes. But for me, it wasn't so much about the behind the scenes science. I was the singer and dancer on all the home videos, and I was not afraid of the camera. And so growing up, I would watch the Weather Channel and the local channels and just amazed at these meteorologists in front of me on screen helping communicate the weather and when there was bad weather going through warnings and whatnot. And so at a very early age, I decided that's what I wanted to do with my life. And here I am. And I'm 16 years into my career and I've done that. And it's been a great career. But in 2017, I covered a story on the NOAA GOES weather satellite program, one of the local National Weather Service offices in Santa Barbara, Los Angeles area. I was working in the Santa Barbara station. They were taking some of the data, the preliminary data from the first of the GOES satellite and getting ready for what would be GOES West, the second. And the more we talked about satellites and how important that role was, I realized there wasn't a lot of journalists out there that were covering things like that. They would cover the launch and it was cool, but nobody was really explaining how these satellites were changing the way we were forecasting weather. And as a scientist myself, having a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology, I realized I had such a privilege being a storyteller and a journalist to sit down with these experts that would go into the science and go into the STEM topics, but I could understand it because I was a scientist myself. So I could put together a story with visuals to help people at home better understand what was going on. And then I got to go out to Vandenberg Space Force Base, and I actually covered a launch. And I did a whole story on the behind the scenes of the meteorologists who contributed to the launches happening, giving the green light or not. And I just realized I had this passion for space as well. And I really enjoyed reporting on satellites and kind of taking these non-verbalized topics, or these things that you might read about in books, but were actually happening behind the scenes. And I started to do more and more stories. And that's how I got my nickname Rocket Girl. I covered my first launch in, I believe it was 2018. It was the GOES S satellite, the second in the series. And I've just kind of went with it. I've been bitten by the space bug, and now I found out it's just as much part of me as weather is part of me.
That's fantastic. And I guess a lot of space fans listening are quite aware of the impact that weather has on rocketry, especially. Mainly on, well, entirely on Earth, really, because, it's that final countdown until it actually takes off. It could be scrubbed. Any rocket launch could be scrubbed at the last minute due to some slight changing weather. But what about, obviously, it doesn't really apply to the moon. There isn't much weather there. But what about Mars as if you put your meteorologist hat on and look at Mars, how much of an impact is the weather there when humanity is sending rovers and maybe rockets and maybe people one day? How is that sort of? What are your thoughts about that?
It's something where that'd be cool to go to Mars and do some forecasting out there. There'd be obviously a lot of learning, because just like when I went to school and I got my degree in meteorology, you have to learn how there's certain parts of the country and the world that weather impacts differently than others. If there's valleys, if there's hills, if there's topography, if you're at sea level, if you have storms coming in off of bodies of water. And so that's all going to apply on pretty much every planet. It's just learning the differences and learning what types of weather that planet has and studying that. But then you also have to think about space weather. And I know a lot of people only think about that when we think about the aurora, but space weather impacts so many things. We hear about communication issues and GPS systems that can be altered, but think about it as well. If you have a solar storm coming through space, our astronauts have to be protected. If we're sending off a launch and they're going through space and they're going to be out doing spacewalks, or they're going to be in their space shuttle, we really have to think about how those space weather changes could make it detrimental or dangerous for our astronauts to be traveling. And then if they impact planets and whatnot. So there's a lot of undiscovered territory there. But as a scientist, I think it's an exciting thing that people should start looking into it. And I think over time, we can be as skilled with forecasting. Obviously, it's never perfect. It's a science. It's always going to be a science. And even the most trained meteorologists that have been in the business for decades, we still could be having everything right about a forecast, and one minuscule thing changes and the forecast is completely different. And I think the general public doesn't understand sometimes that we give our best forecast as possible, but if something changes, we can tell you why. But I think more times than not, people just want to blame us. Oh, you said 2 inches of snow and we got 2 feet. But when you actually give us an opportunity to explain what happened, it makes sense. And just like we do things every day in our life that's trial and error, it's the same thing with forecasting. You're going to be right a lot of the time, but you're also going to be wrong. And you have to be able to admit that humbly.
Absolutely. And especially in London, I mean, it's it's always it's not always raining. Actually, I think London gets a bad rep, but yeah, it'd be nice to know. I mean, as you say, technology is getting better, but just focusing on Earth and thinking about AI is a very hot topic at the moment. How do you see the field of meteorology evolving in the coming years with the rise of AI and machine learning? Do you think we're going to see weather reporting that is sort of closer and closer to being 100% able to predict the future? Or do you think nature's always going to have that edge where it could change its mind at any moment for no apparent reason?
Let's think of the movie Jurassic Park, because I know there's a lot of people that have watched it. And I believe there's the quote that nature always finds a way. And I still believe that's true, because even now, sometimes we can have the best forecast for a hurricane, for example, and one small change and it goes completely off course. And there might have been some models that would have suggested an earlier turn or whatnot, but to put your eggs all in one basket, it's tough. And it's
Mm.
scary sometimes to think, yes, this could be right, but sometimes, like I mentioned, even the smallest changes can have the biggest impacts. And, I think AI is going to be helpful. It's going to help with accuracy and improving things. I actually did a whole story, which you can check out at space.com, on how now the when it comes to fire weather forecasting, how they've incorporated at NOAA using AI to help pinpoint where lightning strikes are going to be, working in tandem with tools on our GOES satellite programs. For example, the geostationary lightning mapper, which will pick up from space where lightning strikes are happening and can help predict if it's moving into an area where there's dry brush, that the likelihood of a wildfire sparking would increase. So they're using now these algorithms and these computer models to help work with that, to predict ahead of time where they think lightning would strike. And it's been pretty accurate from their findings over the last several years. And so while it's great and it is improving, I hate to say things are perfect, because even as we know, as humans, nobody's perfect. And so I think we always need to keep in the back of our minds that as accurate as a forecast could be, there sometimes could be those small shifts. But I think AI is playing a strong role, but we also have to be careful not to trust a computer 100%, because, that's when we put our trust in something that we don't have any control over. We've seen the movies on it, and not like, saying, oh my gosh, iRobot's going to take over the world or anything like that. But we have to remember, with great power comes great responsibility as well. And so as long as we're being responsible and we're using these tools for help and not hurt, I think it'll be successful moving forward.
Sure. I think that's the key word, responsible, which I don't know if you can trust any human or company or government to be entirely responsible when it comes to AI on anything. But we'll see, I guess. But this is a question I've always wanted to ask someone. Can you control the weather with technology? I've seen sort of clickbaity articles saying, so and so country has got a cloud machine, and how much control does humanity have over the weather? And can you see a future with technology where we can control it over wide areas?
Well, first off, if I could control the weather, I would be living in a mansion and probably driving a nice Lamborghini. I don't know how much I'd pay for my weather controlling. I think there are methods to recreate weather. I mean, there are definitely things that you can hear about, such as cloud seeding, or, the different types of ingredients it takes to make a cloud. But I think to try to control the weather would be disastrous. Like we talked about, that's almost like putting a chip in an animal to control it. But then the chip breaks and then the animal goes crazy. I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but like I was mentioning earlier, we have to be careful with how much power we want to have over things, because when you try to mess with the dynamics of something that, like nature, for example, that's already complex, but for decades and back in history, we know has always done its own thing and moved in different directions. There were ice ages billions of years ago on the same planet that we call home now. This planet used to be a frozen ball of ice, and look how it is flourishing now. But if we get too much messing with what's going on, I feel like we're going to alter the dynamics of what's already happening. And
Mm.
I just think we need to be very careful with something like weather, with something like nature trying to control things. You just think of a human society and what happens when you try to control people. You have fights, you have rebellions, I think just like we live our lives as a natural state, we should let nature do its thing. And there's things we can do to prepare better or forecast better, but our climate's changing. And if we try to go from one extreme to the next, I think it personally could be disastrous.
Yeah, I get you. I was just thinking about maybe, humanity is living on Mars in 100 years' time. Will we have the technology to recreate the sort of cyclical seasons of Earth? But yeah, who knows? It seems like science fiction.
Yeah, it does. But a lot of stuff from science fiction, look at Back to the Future. How many things from that movie do we say, wow, that's happening now, or our favorite science fiction movies? And we're like, we actually have done that. So I guess anything is possible. But again, we really have to be careful with how much we want to control. I always like the analogy with sand. I mean, you hold sand in your hand and it stays there, but the minute you start to grasp it,
Yeah.
it's going to leak out. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think you can create controlled environments, just like, if you have a big dome or something, you could probably create certain feelings or certain temperatures and stuff like that. But I think to actually try to mess with the creation, with God's world, like I just don't think the weather there would be that be something we want to mess with.
Yeah, so maybe there is a sensible case to at least live in caves or
Yeah.
human-made habitats, at least at the start, anyway. And I love this conversation we're having, by the way, because we've named, I think, 5 or 6 of my favorite films,
Oh,
which
good.
is
Yay,
great.
mine too.
um, I'm going to bring up the topic that you don't really talk about it much in space, but that's climate change. Obviously, being a scientist and meteorologist, that's something that's very topical. So much data on the subject, but also not a huge amount sort of long term. Do you feel a responsibility to talk about the impact of climate change when it comes to the weather? And do you think there's sort of how do you think the space industry sort of talks about climate change? Because I know there's a lot of comparisons made all the time, but I'd see them sort of different people preaching. There's the kind of the space crowd, and then there's like the climate change crowd. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, no, and it's always one of those debatable topics. And, one of the things that always bothers me is people that talk about things but don't have the science or the research to back it. They just want to have their own opinion based on what they know. And that's great, but with something like climate change, where we've been doing research on this for decades, and now we are starting to see the impacts. I mean, there's studies out there. I know NASA has this hub you can actually go to online that'll show how our climate's changed, and you can see what the greenhouse emissions are looking like and where they were. And I think it's taking tools like that and having something like that before we have the conversations is so important, because as we know, this is a society where you can go online and Google anything, or you can go on social media and talk about whatever you want, and more times than not there's misinformation, and then it takes more damage control from scientists such as myself to get out there and say, hey, no, we're trusted sources. I
Mm,
have this paper to back me up. We've done research with these scientists or this university. And I think you just have to find reputable sources. But I do think as a nation, there is a lot of things that are happening that are natural cycle from climate change. But I do feel the research is also showing the increase in these greenhouse gas emissions and how we are seeing the weather change based on that. And I feel like it's a combination. And if we have studies that are showing us, okay, maybe the emissions in this 10-year period were high, or the factories in this location, there's proof that's showing this, then we should pay attention to that. But I mean, this is life, and life is, every day is going to be different than the next. And we, like I said, had an ice age billions of years ago, and somehow our planet got to this livable planet that we're on now. And that was the climate changing naturally without anybody altering it. And it went from an ice age to a livable planet. So I just think if we see the signs and we have the research on things, we need to pay attention. And we also need to ask ourselves, what can we do to be better? And it might be like, oh, not driving to work so many days a week. But if you think about it, if you're the only one doing it in your community, that's really not going to make an impact. I think as a nation, as a global entities, we need to come together and talk to our leaders and the people that are the experts and say, hey, how can we be better? And what can we do to help lessen this? Because just like anything, damage is always going to be done. Some things can't be reversed or can't be undone. But if there are ways that we can contribute to slow down processes or to make things a little bit better, then we should definitely pay attention.
for sure, for sure. Um, we talked just before we started recording about the satellite conference, which is next week when this episode goes out. You're going to be hosting some panels there, and I was just wondering what your opinion was on the role of satellites evolving in weather forecasting and climate monitoring. We see hundreds, thousands of new satellites going up every year. But how reliant are we on satellites to improve the weather? Um, uh, when it comes to forecasting and climate monitoring.
They're great. I've made, I don't even know how many, countless forecasts in my career. And I've covered all different types of things: snowstorms, severe weather, hurricanes, blizzards, droughts. And I think they're, like a tool like anything else. And it's great to have because we're getting these images back and giving us more time to issue warnings. We can see storms starting to develop. But a lot of the expertise also comes for what's currently happening, the nowcasting aspect, as I like to call it. And so when you're using your experience knowing how certain storms react in certain types of environments, or if a cold front, you can spot it on the satellite, but it's coming into an area where the temperatures are, we can use this recent United States storm that we had in the last couple of weeks back. We had actually a severe weather outbreak come through Illinois, Indiana, into Ohio, and we had tornadoes just outside of Chicago, which is a major city. But the ingredients were right there. And because we were following the storm system, because we had the data way before the storm was coming in, we could look at it on satellite. We could use tools, like I said, the geostationary lightning mapper on our GOES satellite to see where the storms were increasing, because the more lightning strikes you see, for example, that's an indicator of a strengthening storm system. And when you start to see these things and you put it together with your knowledge and your background, it helps you make a stronger forecast to get that tornado watch out there, to issue warnings. If something starts to look on the radar a little bit nervous, you can issue a warning to help give people the advance time. And from when I was starting in the business to where I am now, I feel like forecasting has improved significantly. And I think having as many outlets as we can, including these videos and images that we're getting from satellites, is going to help us be better as forecasters, without the technology, but as humans, if that makes sense.
It does massively. And obviously, understandably, you're quite US focused, and the US is so big geographically, multiple time zones and every climate you can imagine. But a lot of when you look at things like the weather, it's obviously, and climate change, it's a global challenge. So how have satellites changed the significance of international collaboration when it comes to meteorology and looking back at the Earth? Because when you sort of look at these bigger picture impacts of things like climate change, you kind of need a global snapshot, and there's companies like Planet, sort of cover global and give global insights. How important is that, the international collaboration, when it comes to satellites and looking at the climate?
And that's actually great you bring that up, because a couple of years ago, I had a panel on satellites when it came to that sort of thing. Planet was on my panel. Tomorrow.io was on my panel. These companies that have just emerged and seeing the need for, yes, we've got our government like NOAA that has these great satellites and we're getting these big picture things. But for these other smaller companies, they're not just focused on the United States, for example. They are finding ways to get satellite data to these small communities in places like Africa or around the world where they really don't have the technology or have the advancements that we hear in the United States, but they're able to get this satellite data and they're able to put out these images and this information that's going to help decision makers all over the world make better decisions based on what's going on. I mean, you think about the Starlink satellites, for example, from SpaceX, and they're helping get internet to places where it otherwise would not be possible. And then people in those areas that are in either a rural area or an area they don't have a lot of connectivity to the outside world, now they have that opportunity where they can log into these apps and they can get these forecasts because they have that connection. And so I really like what a lot of these smaller private companies are doing, saying, hey, okay, we know as the government you've got this, but we're also trying to fit in those other pieces so together we can work as a collaboration all across the globe and help solve these problems and get this information out there that's needed.
Well, we live in a really interesting time where there's there's huge data sets that are so accessible to anyone who has access to the internet globally. So it's a great opportunity for startups and all these different companies that can use that data and make new models and look at the world in different ways. So to anyone listening that's maybe a student or interested in meteorology and space science, space weather, what advice would you give to them? Where do they look for inspiration as to how space is used when looking at Earth, and how one might consider a career in space weather, if that's even such a thing you can focus on, which I'm sure it is.
I think there are degrees actually out there now, or master's programs that you can go back to school for space weather. Well, first off, reach out to people that are doing that. I know I'm kind of one of the inaugural scientists that are doing that as a broadcast meteorologist now, also really putting a big emphasis on space. And so, send out those emails, connect on LinkedIn, ask the questions. And I think also think about what you're really passionate about. And if, weather and space is something that you're saying, wow, I really like forecasting on Earth, but I kind of want to forecast in space. Talk to these companies, like we mentioned, Planet or Tomorrow IO, and say, hey, you're kind of connecting that concept. If down the road I wanted a career to do something like you guys are doing, is there somebody that's on your team right now I could talk to that does something like that? And we also have to think too, if we have all this stuff here on Earth, just like we're planning on building things on other planets and planning on having different transportation methods through space, there's going to be a need down the road for scientists, for space, and for other planets. And yeah, it might be a pretty far away thing, but I really do feel space is what climate change was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, a lot of people didn't really talk about it, or it was like controversial. Nobody had a lot of information. Now, 10 years later, we have governments actually putting policies in place to help fight back and help combat these issues we have with climate change. And I think in the next 10 years, the more we start to get out there with exploration and actually going to these other planets, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to become a big topic. So now is the time, if you feel that passion, if you feel that interest, don't be afraid to reach out and to ask people, like, how can I make a career down the road out of this? Because one of the things, and I'm sure you can agree with me, Ben, about the space community, is space is for everybody. We need engineers in space, just like we need engineers to manufacture cars. We need scientists to make experiments on the space station, just like we are doing experiments here. We're going to need doctors in space. If somebody gets sick up there, that they're going to help them feel better, just like going to the ER room here on Earth. So the more we can stress that space is for everybody, the more exciting career paths I think people are going to have. And then the more as society we're going to get excited about what we're going to be able to do in space in the next couple decades.
Fantastic. Well, look, it's been so great to chat to you today. Just before you go, can you share any upcoming projects or initiatives that you're working on at the moment? Anything you can announce or something you've got in the works for 2024? Would love to hear what you're sort of up to. Not directly after this call, but at some point this year.
No, I'm excited. I have joined it's called the Open Notebook, and it's right now in the United States, and it's a mentoring program for journalists that work on science, that work on space, climate reporting, and I serve as a mentor for a year term, and we kind of help out pitch story ideas, answer questions, best practices based on what we have learned. And so if you do know anyone in the States that's a journalist, an aspiring journalist that wants to work on health and science and climate reporting, the Open Notebook, it's great because there's mentors needed, but also mentees, people that want to learn. That's been great. I will be at Satellite Conference on the Thursday. I will be doing a panel as a moderator, and we're going to be talking about how satellites are helping during crisis situations or natural disasters, which is going to be really cool. We have somebody from FEMA. We have a couple private companies that'll be talking. So that'll be a really interesting topic that starts at 11 Eastern time. And then I'll be at the Space Symposium in April, if anyone will be going to that. It's a great event to get excited about space in Colorado Springs. And for the eclipse, actually, that'll be crossing our path here in the United States. I will actually be hosting a really cool event at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas. That'll have experts from NOAA and NASA and the National Science Foundation and a couple really cool guests that are super space passionate that'll be there. So if you're in Dallas, don't forget to say hi. And I think personally, my goal is just continuing to develop this role that I've been put into, being not just a meteorologist and a scientist, but also a storyteller for the space community, and using what I've learned as a scientist to help sit down with these experts in STEM and space fields and take the nitty gritty and the things that maybe seem foreign when you look at them on paper and bring these stories to life to help get the public excited. And so, being a freelance writer for space.com, I'm always looking for great national and global stories to share. So feel free to pitch your ideas anytime. And if I can help you tell your story, I absolutely will.
That's amazing. And I'll put all these links in the show notes as well, so people can just click there if they're interested in any or all of them. Meredith, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. Let's have a fantastic day.